Hello and welcome to Creating Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. We are so excited to have you join us today as we are going to be looking at a proverb. Yes, one of the wise sayings that is penned in the book of Proverbs. There are many of them that speak to us every day, but today we're going to be looking at a particular one that is found almost at the very end of the book. So we hope you enjoy this message that is brought to you by the Lord, and we hope it blesses you today. Today we live in a world of selfishness. If you think about it, everywhere we go, people are constantly and continually grabbing for more, trying to get the most they can, and not sharing with everyone around them. In fact, if I'm honest, and if you're honest, we probably have this kind of attitude more than we should. It's not a healthy attitude to have, but just because of the way the world works today, we often display that kind of attitude. We take part in that type of behavior despite the fact that we should be better, that we shouldn't be that way. We should be generous, we should share, we shouldn't always be grabbing for the most we can get. But that's the world we live in today. The story is told of the co-founder of the Methodist denomination, John Wesley, of incredible generosity. You see, Wesley lived in a time in England where money was not just tough to come by, it was truly and honestly scarce. There was very, very little to go around just because of the financial situation in England. And you see, it's told that John Wesley, despite this, actually made quite a living. Because of the famous preacher he became, he made about £1,400 a year. And if we were to transfer that for inflation and so forth to today's money, Wesley probably would have been making about $300,000 a year. So Wesley was no poor man. But Wesley lived by a certain principle, a few different principles, in fact, that he held very near and dear to his own heart. You see, what Wesley did was, despite the fact that he made £1,400, he lived on only £30 a year. He gave the rest of it away. You see, he didn't tithe. He didn't only give 10% away. He actually gave away 98% of his annual income and lived on just the other 2%. Incredible. And as the story goes, Wesley lived on a very certain principle. There was 3 principles, in fact. They're very simple, but Wesley lived these to a T. And those principles are this: gain as much as you can, save as much as you can, give as much as you can. And Wesley lived by that religiously. In fact, he said these words in a sermon of his once. "It is an excellent gift of God," he claims, "answering the noblest ends. In the hands of his children, it is food for the hungry, drink for the thirsty, raiment for the naked. It gives to the traveler and the stranger where to lay his head," he says about money. "By it we may supply the place of a husband to the widow and of a father to the fatherless. We may be a defense for the oppressed, a means of health to the sick, of ease to them that they are in pain. It may be as eyes to the blind, as feet to the lame, yea, a lifter up from the gates of death. It is therefore of the highest concern that all who fear God know how to employ this valuable talent, that they be instructed how it may answer these glorious ends and in the highest degree." You see, to Wesley, money was not a bad thing. But he was generous with it. He didn't hoard it. He didn't take it all for himself and give to nobody. Wesley gave it away, and it gave him joy. It gave him goodness. He was a generous, generous man. He lived by that principle of being generous. There is a book entitled The Power of Good. It's a collection of short stories written by Mark McCrindle. And one of the stories in there is about the author, Geraldine Brooks. You see, when Geraldine was a child, she loved to read. She loved to read, and she would read as much as she could get her hands on. But she couldn't always get her hands on the nicest books and the nicest things. So her father once wrote a letter to the author Althea Gillespie. And Gillespie responded every birthday and every Christmas for Brooks by gifting her an expensively bound book. And inside she would write, "For Geraldine Brooks, with love, Althea Gillespie." You see, Brooks actually never met Gillespie, but she says this. She is tremendously grateful to Gillespie for fostering this love for reading. And in Brooks's own words, she said that she would say this to her if she could. "I have no idea what this woman spent so much time and thought on a child she didn't know. Whatever the reason, I wish I could thank her in person. I wish I could tell her how those books shored up a love for the written word that grew over time into a career and a calling. I would like to give her one of the books I've written, a nice hardback first edition. The signature wouldn't be half as fine and fluid as hers, but in my own pedestrian scrawl, I would say thank you. Thank you for the gifts that helped me learn to lead a life in books." We live in a world that is not often generous. We live in a world where people are selfish. We live in a world where people constantly grab for more. They want this and they want that, and they hoard and they don't share. But in that world, we are called to be different. We are called to be people of generosity, of goodness, and of sharing. In fact, today we're going to open up to a text in Scripture, a text in the book of Proverbs. We're going to open up, in fact, to the very last chapter of Proverbs, Proverbs 31. And we're going to read here some wise words that apply to each and every one of us. So we're going to read, and we're going to read here, Proverbs 31, verse 1 says, "The sayings of King Lemuel, an inspired utterance his mother taught him." Now let's pause there for a moment. And the first question that arises as we read this proverb is, who is this? Who is King Lemuel? Well, the truth is, nobody actually knows. No one knows who King Lemuel is because this is the one and only time he is mentioned in the Bible. He is not mentioned elsewhere. And although scholars and theologians have done their digging, there isn't anything else on him that they can base it off of. Some believe that King Lemuel is just another way to say King Solomon, and that is a possibility, but we don't know that for sure. But King Lemuel says some important things nonetheless. So let's continue reading. And there are a few stanzas here, 3 stanzas to be exact, in this proverb. So we're going to first read stanza number 1. And each of these stanzas says something important. In fact, we can sum up each of these stanzas in a short phrase or a short sentence. So the first stanza, if we were to sum it up, says this: don't be distracted. And as we read these 3 stanzas, there are going to be 2 warnings and then 1 call, 1 encouragement. And the first one here is this warning: do not be distracted. So let's read it together. Proverbs 31, verses 2 and 3. "Listen, my son. Listen, son of my womb. Listen, my son, the answer to my prayers. Do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings." Listen, my son. Listen, son of my womb. Now, if we read it, we can kind of feel this flavor here, that each call, each question, each call to listen kind of increases in intensity. King Lemuel's mother, whoever she may be, is calling King Lemuel not to be distracted. You can see it right there in the text. Listen, my son. Listen, son of my womb. Listen, my son, the answer to my prayers. And then she asks him, or she tells him, she says, don't spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings. She is calling him not to look to the left or to the right. She is calling him to stay on the straight and narrow path. And to him, she is saying, do not be an adulterer. Don't become distracted. Don't go to the left or the right. Don't ruin your kingship. Don't ruin your marriage. Don't be that type of person. Author Bernie Zilbergeld talks about monogamy, in fact, and he says this: I am steadfastly for monogamy. Adultery is almost certainly going to make a dent in trust and intimacy, and in many cases I've known, it has destroyed them altogether. Zilbergeld says, a woman who is conducting a secret affair has to become deliberately deceitful, like a CIA agent or a spy. She can't just come home and spill forth the events of her day. She's got to think, what can I safely talk about? And what have I got to keep to myself? So even when the infidelity isn't discovered, it changes who you are. A person goes from being candid and open to being secretive and hidden. You see, adultery is a tough thing. And like Zilbergeld says, even if it is never discovered, it changes a person. They go from a person who is just that, who is honest and candid and open about who they are to their spouse or their significant other, to a person who is secretive and hidden and going behind the other person's back. It changes things. Many of you, no doubt, will probably remember the televangelist Jim Bakker and his wife Tammy Faye Bakker. They were famous for their fundraising and for their preaching on TV, but Bakker and his whole empire fell apart. It fell apart because of something familiar. In fact, David Hawking, a reporter, says this: it is reported today, in July of 1990, in the news that former PTL leader and TV evangelist Jim Bakker, now jailed for various fundraising improprieties, makes 11 cents an hour cleaning toilets in the penitentiary. And a federal judge ruled that the little money he has accumulated could be seized to pay penalties he owes of over $500,000. His empire crumbled when he had an adulterous relationship with Jessica Hahn. You see, adultery is not a good thing. It's a big distraction. And you might sit here and say to me, okay, Austin, I understand that. Adultery certainly is a distraction, and it's more than that. But I'm not that kind of person. That's not the kind of thing that's going to distract me. But I would say to you, okay, sure, maybe you aren't committing adultery. Maybe you're not that type of person. But the truth still remains, as King Lemuel's mother says here. Do not become distracted, because there are many, many other distractions that may take up your time and your thought. Whether it's adultery or not, it could be other things. Things that may just seem innocent, like work, other things in your personal life that creep in and distract you from what's important. Or maybe it's money. Maybe it's a hobby you enjoy. It could be something else altogether. But the truth is, those kinds of things do become distractions. And we must be careful, as King Lemuel's mother warns us. Don't let those things become the main thing. It's okay if certain small things are peripheral, if you enjoy a hobby, if you work hard, but don't let small things become a big distraction and change your relationship with God and your relationship with others. So that's the first thing she says. Don't be distracted. But then there's a second thing. She moves on And we're going to read this second stanza. It is verses 4 to 7. And if I had to choose a phrase, something small, to summarize this warning, I would say this. I would say she's saying, don't be irresponsible. So let's read it together. King Lemuel's mother's saying is, "It is not for kings, Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, not for rulers to crave beer, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed, and deprive all the oppressed of their rights. Let beer be for those who are perishing, wine for those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more." She is pretty straightforward. She's pretty tough there. She doesn't mince words. Now, if we are honest with ourselves and take what she says seriously and go back and do our research on the original text, King Lemuel's mother is probably not saying never drink at all. She's probably saying something more like don't get drunk, don't become dependent on alcohol. In fact, you can read it there in the text. She says, "Let beer be for those who are perishing, wine for those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more." Because strong drink, or alcohol, during that time, was used to deaden the pain. It was an anesthetic, if you will, and many people today still use it for that reason. And King Lemuel's mother is saying, no, 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 have nothing to do with that. It is not only wrong, it will ruin you. Be a better person. Don't allow it to be that way. Don't be irresponsible. Don't let something peripheral become something in the center. Don't be irresponsible. Don't shirk your duties, she says. Bernard L. Brown, Jr., someone who's worked in healthcare, tells a story in a hospital of a patient who had spilled a bit of water on the floor and had called the nurse's aide to come in and mop it up because the patient was afraid that someone would slip and fall, and he didn't want that to happen. And so the nurse's aide came in and saw the spill on the floor, and unbeknownst to the patient, the hospital policy was that if the spill or the puddle was small, that it was the nurse's aide's job to clean it up. But if the spill or the puddle was large, it was the job of the hospital housekeeping to come in and mop it up. Well, the nurse's aide decided that it was a large spill, so she called housekeeping, and housekeeping came up, and lo and behold, they decided it was a small spill, naturally. And so the nurse's aide and the housekeeping person went back and forth, arguing about whose job it was to clean up this spill. So much so that the patient became frustrated, and he took a pitcher of water and just poured it on the floor and said, "Okay, is it large enough for the both of you now to just clean it up?" And Lemuel's mother says, "Don't be irresponsible. Be responsible for what you are supposed to be doing. Clean up your own messes, take care of your own people. Don't be irresponsible." So far, we have had two warnings. The first is don't be distracted, and the second is don't be irresponsible. These are important warnings. King Lemuel's mother gives them for a very good reason. She gives them to her son, and then by extension to each and every one of us, so we can learn, so we can be better people. But then there is a third and final stanza. And if I had to sum up this stanza, it is not a warning. It is more of a call, an encouragement. And so if I were to choose something to summarize it, I would say it is, instead be generous. So we have had two things so far. Don't be distracted. Don't be irresponsible. Instead, be generous. So let's read the text. It says this, verses 8 and 9 of Proverbs 31. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. Instead, be generous. It's what we are called to be as followers of Christ. To be generous. I'm going to read you a few stories I came across on Reader's Digest online. And they're about generosity. And a few different people talk about generosity in different ways. Raimo Moisa from North Salem, New York, says this: I was running through the streets of New York, soaking wet, thanks to a sudden storm, when I heard a voice. Do you need an umbrella? It was a woman standing in the doorway of a hotel. She grabbed an umbrella and handed it to me, saying, now you have at least one more reason to believe there's humanity in this world. Continuing on my way, I was now not only protected by an umbrella, but also by the kindness that shows up now and then in the world. Last year, Matthew Flores, a 12-year-old from Sandy, Utah, approached postal worker Ron Lynch and asked if he had any extra advertisements or random newsletters. The boy explained that he loved to read but couldn't afford books or even the bus fare to the library, so he would take anything the mailman had. Lynch was floored. He didn't want electronics. He didn't want to sit in front of the TV playing games all day. The kid just wanted to read, Lynch told DeseretNews.com. Lynch asked his friends on Facebook for reading material. Soon, Flores was getting books from all over the world, the United States, England, and even India. For his part, Flores said that he plans to read all the books, then share them with other book-starved kids. And finally, Hashmik Madazian from Glendale, California says this: 30 years ago, my world almost fell apart. I had surgery, was fired, and was informed by the IRS that my employer had not paid employment taxes. After a few weeks, I saw a flyer about a Japanese festival. Although a physical and emotional wreck, I decided to go. There, I met a Japanese gentleman with whom I chatted for a few hours. A few months later, I came home to find a bouquet of flowers and a letter at my door. It was from that same friend. Inside the letter was a check for $10,000 to help me through my rough patch. 16 years later, I met a family that had been evicted from their home and needed $5,000 to close escrow on a new house. Without hesitation, I handed them a check for the full amount. They called me their angel, but I reminded them that I, too, once had an angel. Don't be distracted. Don't be irresponsible. Instead, be generous. And I understand that we don't all have the financial resources to write checks for $5,000 or $10,000 at the drop of a hat. But generosity is more than that. Generosity, perhaps, is just handing someone an umbrella who is getting rained on. And each and every one of us has a duty, a responsibility, to be generous to the world around us. In fact, if you read this book, if you read it from cover to cover, you will find that there are many generous people in the Bible, and there are also those who are not generous. And those who are, although they may not have much in this world, have great rewards waiting for them in heaven. And those who are not generous, they may do well here. They may have a lot of money, but they are not happy people. They are not the type of people who we want to model our lives after. In fact, those types of people become miserable. No doubt you remember the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, the famous Christmas story that tells of this miserly man who counts his coins and gives nothing away, so much so that he even has an employee work on Christmas Day. And he is a miserable man. He is a miserable man until the end of the story, when he is told and taught to become generous, to give, to be a person of generosity. So as we look back at this text, we don't know who King Lemuel is, much less King Lemuel's mother, but she has taught him some important things. Listen, my son, she says, listen, son of my womb. Listen, my son, the answer to my prayers. Do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings. Don't be distracted. Don't let those things that are bad, and even those that are good, become the center of your attention. Understand what should be in the center and what is the main thing. It is not for kings, Lemuel, she says. It is not for kings to drink wine, not for rulers to crave beer, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and deprive all of the oppressed of their rights. Let beer be for those who are perishing, wine for those who are in anguish. Let them drink and forget their poverty and remember their misery no more. She says, don't be irresponsible. Don't let those kinds of things take away your attention to what's important. Be responsible. Then finally, she says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Instead, be generous. So we stand here today with a couple of warnings. Don't be distracted, don't be irresponsible, and a call to be generous. And I can't make you do those things, but I would encourage you to take those warnings and to take that call seriously. There are wise words in Proverbs, words that it would do us good to follow. Thank you so much for joining us today on Creating Disciples. We hope you have been blessed, and we hope you join us next time for another message.